On the morning of April 8, 1994, an electrician arrived at a Seattle mansion to install a security system. What he found instead would become one of the most analyzed, debated, and disputed pieces of paper in the history of American popular culture. Lying near a body beside a shotgun and a pen was a single handwritten note, 4 pages long, addressed to an imaginary childhood friend named Bodder. Most of the note reads like a farewell letter from a man exhausted by fame, by pain, by the relentless machinery of being Kurt Cobain. But then, at the very bottom, something changes. The handwriting shifts. The tone shifts. And for 30 years, forensic experts, journalists, and ordinary people around the world have asked the same quiet, unsettling question. Who wrote those last 4 lines? Kurt Cobain was 27 years old when he died. He had already compressed more cultural impact into a single decade than most artists manage in a lifetime. Nirvana had not simply sold records, they had detonated something. They had taken the frustration and alienation of a generation and handed it back in the form of 3 chords and a scream. Smells Like Teen Spirit didn't just top charts, it felt like a transmission from somewhere raw and true. And Cobain was the reluctant center of all of it. A man from Aberdeen, Washington, who had grown up poor, unsettled, moving between relatives, sketching obsessively in notebooks, teaching himself guitar in a way that was less about craft and more about survival. By early 1994, the weight of everything had become visible. He had survived an overdose in Rome just weeks before his death, an incident that his wife, Courtney Love, described as a suicide attempt, though it was publicly characterized at the time as an accident. He had checked into a rehabilitation facility in Los Angeles on April 1st, only to climb over a fence and disappear. His credit cards were tracked to Seattle. Private investigators were hired. Phone calls were made. And then, on April the 5th, in the greenhouse above the garage of his Lake Washington home, Kurt Cobain died from a single shotgun wound to the head. The medical examiner ruled the death a suicide. The case was closed almost immediately. No autopsy photographs were released for years. No inquest was ever formally held. What was released, eventually, was the note. And that is where this story becomes something other than a simple tragedy. Because when forensic document examiners, handwriting analysts, and investigators began looking closely at that note, really looking, they found something that has never been fully explained. The bulk of the letter is consistent with Cobain's known handwriting. It is emotional, literary, filled with the same self-aware contradictions that ran through his journals and letters. He writes about not being able to fake the enthusiasm his audience deserves. He writes about loving people more than he can express. He thanks his fans with a warmth that feels real and aching. It is, by almost every account, the work of a man in genuine torment saying something like, "Goodbye." But those last 4 lines are different. Physically, visibly, measurably different. The pen pressure changes. The letter formation changes. The slant shifts. Where the rest of the note flows in the loose, sloping style, familiar from Cobain's notebooks and personal correspondence, the final lines are more controlled, more deliberate, more vertical. Handwriting analysts who have examined the note describe the transition as abrupt. Not the kind of shift you'd expect from someone writing in an emotional state over a period of time. The kind of shift that suggests a different hand. The last 4 lines address Cobain's wife and daughter directly. They read as a specific, practical farewell to Frances Bean and Courtney, grounding, personal, final. And they are signed with Kurt Cobain's name, but the signature itself has been called into question. Compared to authenticated examples of Cobain's signature from the same period, concert contracts, legal documents, personal letters, something is slightly off. Not dramatically off. Not cartoonishly forged. Just subtly, persistently, inexplicably off. Now, it is important to be honest about what we know and what we don't. The Seattle Police Department investigated Cobain's death and concluded suicide. The King County Medical Examiner reached the same conclusion. These are not institutions that reached their findings carelessly, and the majority of people who knew Cobain, bandmates, friends, family members, have largely accepted that conclusion, however painfully. His mother, Wendy O'Connor, told reporters she had been afraid something like this would happen. His friend and producer Butch Vig described a man who had been in profound psychological pain for years. The grief of the people who loved him was not the grief of people who suspected murder. It was the grief of people who had seen it coming and hadn't been able to stop it. And yet, the note remains. In 1994, a private investigator named Tom Grant was hired by Courtney Love to locate Cobain after he disappeared from rehab. Grant was a former Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputy. He was not a conspiracy theorist by background or by nature, but as he pursued the investigation, interviewing witnesses, examining timelines, reviewing evidence, he became increasingly convinced that the official account had gaps, serious gaps. He has spent the decades since methodically documenting his concerns, and while his conclusions have been contested and criticized, his central question keeps returning to the same place. That note and those 4 lines. What follows in this documentary is not an attempt to declare a verdict. The death of Kurt Cobain happened 30 years ago, in a locked greenhouse, and the full truth of what occurred in those final hours may never be recoverable. What we are going to do is something more specific and more disciplined. We are going to look at the forensic evidence that exists around that note. We are going to hear from document examiners and handwriting analysts about what the physical characteristics of the writing actually suggest. We are going to examine the timeline, the witness accounts, and the questions that legitimate investigators have raised over the years. Because whatever you believe about what happened on April the 5th, 1994, the note is an artifact. It is a physical object that can be examined, compared, and analyzed. And what that analysis reveals is not a clear answer. It is something more uncomfortable than a clear answer. It is a genuine mystery, one that begins with 3 pages of anguished, unmistakable Kurt Cobain, and ends with 4 lines that forensic science still cannot fully explain. For more than 3 decades, the debate has never truly gone quiet. Investigators close the case, and then someone opens it again. A retired detective, a forensic linguist, a journalist who cannot let go. And always, they return to the same place. Those 4 lines at the bottom of Kurt Cobain's note. The lines that seem to belong to a different letter entirely. Tom Grant, the private investigator hired by Courtney Love herself to locate Kurt in the days before his body was found, spent years analyzing the handwriting, the language, and the circumstances of that note. His central argument is not fringe speculation. It is rooted in observable detail. The bulk of the letter, he contends, reads as a retirement note, not a farewell to life, but a farewell to music. Cobain writes about the crowd, about his inability to feel the electricity of performance the way he once did. He quotes Neil Young. He talks about his daughter, Frances Bean, with unmistakable tenderness and warmth. not the language of a man making final peace, but of a father who still imagines a future. Then the tone shifts. The handwriting changes its character. The final 4 lines are where the goodbye to life appears. And Grant and others have argued that those lines were written by a different hand, or at minimum, under entirely different circumstances. Handwriting experts who have examined the note have reached conflicting conclusions, which is itself significant. When experts disagree this sharply about a document central to a death investigation, it demands scrutiny. Some analysts noted a subtle but measurable change in pen pressure and letter formation in those final lines. Others dismissed this as consistent with someone in emotional distress, someone whose grip on a pen might falter as grief or intoxication deepened. But here is the problem with that explanation. The toxicology report confirmed that Kurt Cobain had a staggering level of heroin in his system at the time of his death, a concentration that many medical professionals have described as incapacitating. At such levels, the ability to hold a pen, to form coherent sentences, to write anything at all becomes medically questionable. Yet there the note sits, largely legible, largely controlled. The shotgun found at the scene adds another layer of complication. The weapon required a significant reach to discharge in the manner described. Cobain was tall, but the length of the gun, in relation to the wound, has prompted debate among forensic specialists about the physical mechanics of what would have had to occur. The Seattle Police Department has maintained their conclusion, and it would be wrong to suggest that their investigation was careless. But questions about whether a full forensic reconstruction was adequately performed at the time have lingered. Crime scene photographs taken in 1994 were not released publicly for years. When they finally were, they reignited discussion rather than ending it. What is perhaps most haunting is what the note tells us about Kurt Cobain, regardless of its ultimate origin. Whether every word was written by his hand alone or not, the anguish in that letter is real. The struggle with fame, with the loss of artistic innocence, with the unbearable weight of being a symbol for a generation. That pain was documented in his journals, in his interviews, in the music itself. Cobain was a man who felt everything at a frequency most people cannot sustain. He had attempted to leave a rehabilitation facility just days before his death. He had spoken about not wanting to be alive. None of that is invention. And yet, the questions about those 4 lines will not dissolve simply because the surrounding context is tragic. Forensic document examination is not a subjective art. It is a discipline with standards and methodology. When those methods are applied and produce uncertainty, that uncertainty deserves acknowledgement. The Seattle Police Department briefly reopened their inquiry in 2014, 20 years after Cobain's death, when previously undeveloped rolls of film from the original investigation were discovered. The photographs from those rolls showed the scene in greater detail than what had previously been available. Investigators reviewed the material and again concluded there was no evidence to change the official finding. Many accepted this, many did not. The 4 lines at the bottom of Kurt Cobain's note remain the gravitational center of a mystery that has outlasted trends, outlasted the grunge era itself, outlasted the cultural moment that made Cobain its reluctant prophet. Language analysts who study suicide notes as a body of literature have pointed out that the rhetorical shift in the Cobain note is unusual, not impossible, but unusual. Most notes, even fragmented and emotional ones, carry a consistent psychological voice. The shift from addressing the public to suddenly addressing Courtney and Francis with the explicit farewell language in those final lines has been described by some researchers as a structural anomaly. Others say grief is not structurally consistent and never has been. What we are left with, ultimately, is a document that tells us more than one story at once. It tells us about a man who loved music and lost his relationship with it. It tells us about a father thinking of his child. It tells us about exhaustion so deep it became indistinguishable from surrender. And somewhere within it, in ink and pressure and the curve of particular letters, it may also tell us something we have not yet fully learned to read. The forensic mystery of Kurt Cobain's note is not simply a question about a death. It is a question about truth, about how well we can know anything that happens behind closed doors, about whether the instruments of investigation are always equal to the weight of what they are asked to measure. It is a question about a generation's grief and about the uncomfortable space between official conclusions and persistent doubt. That space does not always mean conspiracy. Sometimes it means we are encountering the limits of what forensic science, in a given moment, was able to do. Kurt Cobain died on or around April the 5th, 1994. He was 27 years old. Whatever the full truth of those final days, the note he left behind, all of it, the part that sounds like a retirement and the part that sounds like a goodbye, is now one of the most analyzed documents in the history of popular music. It is read and reread by scholars, by fans, by investigators, and by ordinary people who simply want to understand. That hunger for understanding is itself a form of tribute. The questions endure because the person mattered. Some mysteries are never solved. Some questions are the answer. Join us soon for another documentary.